So next up, everybody, we have Dr. Rebecca Gordon, who, as a research associate at the University of Cambridge, did a lot of work and wrote many co-authored papers about the role of political leadership in promoting girls' education. And so we will be putting her live now, and I hope you enjoy listening to her and her advice.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Jan. Very happy birthday to you. I've really enjoyed listening to what you put together so far, and I'm looking forward to the sessions that are coming up as well. So I just want to kind of start with a little introduction into how I got into the kind of space of research around girls' education. And then I'll share my PowerPoint and I'll kind of talk a bit through about some of the research that we've been doing. So my own kind of start and introduction into girls' education came from work I was doing with a grassroots organization in rural Bihar in India. And the research that I was doing alongside them at the time was actually focused on gender-based violence. But one of the things that one of the conversations that often came up and was often spoke about was related to the challenges of supporting girls' education for many of the women that were part of this organization. And so this kind of led to some future research that I ended up doing for my PhD, which was looking specifically at the role of this kind of grassroots organization in supporting mothers to support girls' education and looking at some of the kind of challenges that they were facing, particularly in that. So that's how I sort of got into this kind of research in girls' education space. And I'm so grateful to be invited to speak today and to be part of this amazing lineup. So thank you so much for having me. So the work that I'm going to talk a little bit about today is some research that I've been doing at the University of Cambridge, and I'm presenting on behalf of the Research for Equitable Access and Learning Centre. So this research that I'll be speaking about has been undertaken for the Platform for Girls' Education. And the Platform for Girls' Education was established at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in April 2018. And the aim of the research that we were doing was to kind of provide evidence for and be used to be able to influence the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 2020 in Rwanda. Unfortunately, this has been postponed, obviously, due to the ongoing crisis. But I'm really kind of looking forward to sharing some of the findings from these research papers that we've written today. And kind of the guiding aim of this research was, how can we support work to achieve 12 years of quality education for all girls? And I want to just at this stage thank, in particular, the Department, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, who commissioned this work and this research, and also the huge amount of support from the UK's Department for International Development. I also want to thank the Platform for Girls' Education co-chairs and members who have been incredibly supportive of a lot of this research. And also, in some cases, some of these members have participated in interviews with us for this research as well. And we're also really grateful to the United Nations Girls' Education Initiative, who I'm looking forward to hearing their session that they're involved in later today. And just thanking them particularly for their support and guidance throughout. They also produced the policy note for the report on political leadership, and some amazing graphics that are part of that I'm using in the presentation. So thinking about the role of political leadership. So the first question I'm going to try and answer in talking about this research is why there's a need to focus on political leadership to promote girls' education. And then secondly, what role political leadership can play and what kind of framework, priorities and recommendations can we have for mobilizing political leaders for girls' education. So the first report that we wrote as part of this project was titled 12 Years of Quality Education for All Girls, a Commonwealth Perspective. And it sought to situate the current evidence on girls' education with a particular focus on low and lower middle income countries where some of the challenges around access to education group effort was that there have been really important improvements and progress in girls' education. So over the past 20 years, there's been increasing access to primary schooling, with gender parity in primary enrolment being achieved in 31 out of the 44 Commonwealth countries with data that we analysed. But even many girls, particularly those from the most marginalised groups. And so even though gender parity has sometimes been achieved, primary schooling is not universal. So in 12 of the 31 countries that achieved gender parity, more than 10 out of every 100 primary-aged girl was not in primary school. Moreover, in 2017, some of the data was showing that 137 million primary and secondary school-aged children were out of school in these countries, of which approximately half were girls, and represented just half of the global out-of-school population. And I know that a lot of the conversations happening today
Hi, everyone. I'm not sure if you can hear Dr. Rebecca Gordon. I think she's having a few sound issues. So we're just going to try to get those back up and running. And we should be good to go in a few minutes. So just stay tuned. And while you're on here, please do take a moment to donate to the fundraiser I have set up. It is for the Collateral Repair Project, an NGO that works in Amman, Jordan, with refugees from Somalia, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Sudan. And they're absolutely amazing since they have a open door policy that allows anybody to come in if they need it. So I think we are getting word that, I think we're getting it all set up. But thank you so much for tuning in. And remember to tune in throughout the day too. Yes, and by the way, up next, we have Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, who is another YGL, just like Suzanne, and I will be interviewing her and talking about a government's perspective on girls' education. So do make sure you stay tuned for that. And now we will be resuming with Dr. Rebecca Gordon.
Hi, thanks for that. Apologies for the sound. I've taken my headphones off now, so hopefully that will work better. I'll share my PowerPoint again now where we're at. So yeah, I was kind of just going through some of the findings from this framing report that we did. And one of the kind of, again, using kind of the up-to-date data, one of the key findings as well was kind of looking at kind of supporting the data on the learning crisis. And so girls' education in particular, we found that in 14 out of the 26 countries with data, girls who are in school are learning for equivalent of 6 years or less. And so that picture is likely to be much starker for girls in rural areas and those facing other forms of disadvantage. And so one of the things that the report tried to do was then look at the evidence on what works in girls' education, kind of understanding those barriers and looking at some of the potential ways in which we can address some of these issues that the data was highlighting. And this image I've got on the screen now hopefully kind of provides a fairly succinct overview of some of the kind of key findings on what works that we looked at. So the kind of first bit looking at leadership and financing, so the importance of this kind of high-level political commitment, the importance of grassroots leadership, the importance of particularly financing formula funding, targeting resources, particularly at those who are the most at risk of being left behind, and use of data to inform policy change. So the importance of getting a really clear picture on what the situation is. Secondly, the research really found that targeted approaches were kind of very, very important for supporting girls kind of to continue and achieve 12 years of education. And kind of, if you read the report, there's a number of, we've kind of presented a number of these interventions and approaches that have been used. And then the third, looking particularly at tackling discrimination. So we know that discrimination as a result of gender norms and kind of social norms that kind of discriminate against girls, and particularly some of those further areas of disadvantage, are real barriers to girls' education. And so our approaches to achieving this need to really look both within education at tackling discrimination and beyond education. And so from this report, some of the kind of key priorities that were highlighted were noted very much around the role of political leadership in actually creating change for girls' education, and the need to ensure this kind of high-level political leadership that really promotes education planning, adopting a gender equality and empowerment lens, and committing sufficient resources in order to reach the most marginalised girls. And so given that we had this kind of quite a lot of literature looking at what works, the approaches that were working, but that it wasn't necessarily translating into kind of action to achieve education for all girls, the next report that we wrote particularly focused on the role of political leadership. And this report aimed to kind of try and provide some insight into what political leadership was needed, how political leadership could be supported in order to promote 12 years of quality education for all girls. So we started from this kind of point of looking at the literature on leadership, and transformative leadership we kind of chose as an approach and kind of as a focus because it's vital to dismantling entrenched power structures that prevent all girls from accessing 12 years of quality education. And this leadership draws on an approach of raising the level of kind of human conduct and ethical aspirations of both the leader and led, and having a transforming effect on both. And in particular, kind of this transformative leadership is very much associated with feminist approaches to leadership, which arise from this struggle to tackle power relations, to advance gender equality, and to create feminist structures that would not reproduce the patriarchal models that dominated societies and cultures. And as transformational leadership is also particularly concerned with influencing social change, this kind of focus was looking at the role of this kind of leadership to transform structures and ideologies that justify and perpetuate these gender inequality and power imbalances. So kind of using this gender lens to address gender inequities in power that undermine progress and that create barriers to girls' education, but also recognizing that transformation takes time. So whilst there's this kind of a narrow focus on girls' education as very politically salient, we kind of looked at this transformative leadership approach to acknowledge that there are so many intersecting barriers that influence girls' ability to access education. So from the kind of interviews and the review of the evidence with political leaders, we pulled together this sort of diagram as a way to try and explain this kind of approach of transformative leadership to promote girls' education. So overall, this framework is based on three interconnected perspectives. So the idea that there are kind of individual leaders who are motivated to promote girls' education, that they're able to take these opportunities and adopt strategic approaches to push for change. Secondly, that these motivated individuals are able to form and engage collectively in coalitions that have power and legitimacy and influence. And thirdly, that they're able to use these coalitions to contest some of these ideas underpinning the status quo and to promote change. So in particular, tackling these social norms that hold back progress. And part of the reason why we focus on both individual political leadership and this collective is that although individuals are very important, collaborative leadership is very important for the kind of widespread sustained change that's necessary. And in particular, because the challenges facing girls' education go beyond ministries of education, we need to kind of come up with this kind of whole system approach and whole system reform that's could be kind of promoted and work across borders can happen. So we acknowledge that there are a number of different types of leadership, and that these are valued very much kind of in a different way in different locations, and leadership is always situational. And additionally, political systems and electoral processes do vary, obviously, from country to country. So no framework fits in all contexts. But this framework was kind of developed as a guide in identifying this need for high-level political actors and the kind of role in which they play, as well as the importance of collective action and collaborative action, particularly collaborating with women's groups, youth organisations, civil society organisations, and local political, traditional and religious leaders as well. So I'm going to go on to speak a little bit about our findings, and these findings are taken from interviews with 11 senior political leaders who have all been very much involved in promoting girls' education. So the first thing is that we kind of very much heard from a number of these leaders the importance of women's leadership. And the visibility of women can kind of encourage greater political engagement and mobilization, but also that by challenging this kind of perceptions of women in society, women leaders play an important role in contributing to shifts in gender norms and social norms, which has the potential to benefit women and girls worldwide. And we can see some of the kind of quotations here from some of the political leaders that we interviewed. Obviously, this is not a panacea, and women leaders may not necessarily be transformative leaders or support progress in gender equality. But many of the women leaders that we spoke to in the interviews very much reflected on their own personal experiences of gender inequality and spoke about their motivations to kind of promote gender equality more broadly, particularly through the work that they were doing. They also noticed kind of their role and how they could be seen as role models and lead to shifts in gender norms and ideas, and the kind of impact that could have down the line on girls' education. One of the other things that came through really strongly from the interviews that we conducted was the kind of real importance of collective action of political leaders, as achieving reform is very rarely an individual action, but relies on alliances and collective action and advocacy. So the kind of importance of networks and coalitions of political leaders are really vital to tackle issues that are beyond the capacity of individual leaders to resolve. And a really key example of this that came out from our research was of the Forum for African Women Educationalists, established in 1992 by 5 women ministers of education as a Pan-African organisation aimed at promoting girls' education. And as we can see here from these quotations, you can really see the benefit of this collective action, the fact that voices were no longer localized, the fact that there was a lot of cross-context learning about interventions, that there was a kind of a critical mass of support that could make a difference in advancing girls' education. And kind of FAWE, the Forum for African Women Educationalists, have achieved continued kind of progress and recognition, particularly through the kind of long-term engagement with some of these key senior political leaders, notably ministers of education, permanent secretaries, and vice chancellors of universities. And our interviews and review of the evidence kind of found that very much the kind of ongoing strong bonds of trust, the sensitivity to the socio-political terrain, and the reputation as kind of bringing together many leaders who had necessary knowledge and skills were really, really important for the coalition being able to mobilize support for reform and change. Some of the other kind of findings of our interviews and review of the evidence looked at kind of uncovering some of the key factors that can influence and support political leadership for girls' education. And whilst it's not always clear what motivates political leaders, or it's kind of thinking about how some of the influences on political leadership have a really important role to play in kind of helping us understand this role of political leadership in girls' education. So one of the first things that came out in kind of some of these really important factors underpinning the role of political leaders was the kind of linkage with national influence. So the fact that voter pressure, particularly at key points in the electoral cycle, is a really important part of motivating high-level political leaders to commit to girls' education, including heads of government and parliamentarians. And so this quotation here shows a particular example of the provision of sanitary towels, which became an election issue in the 2016 Ugandan elections, and was an important part of kind of motivating presidential candidates in these announcements around the provision of sanitary towels for girls in schools. There are also mentioned in some of these interviews with the kind of critical political moments and changes in political and institutional contexts that provide really important opportunities for political action. Second, in terms of the influencing political leaders, international networks and initiatives have played a really vital role, as well as global frameworks which exert pressure on political leaders and enable some kind of level of accountability on action for girls' education. So this example here is of the Protocol on Gender and Development, which essentially brings together various commitments that certain governments have signed up to. And it is established as a kind of regional monitoring tool that allows political leaders to a kind of framework through which to act, and also a kind of monitoring and accountability mechanism so that they're kind of held to account for the commitments they've made. one of the things that many political leaders noted as being really important to support them in their role in promoting girls' education was the importance of data and evidence. So the kind of necessary kind of understanding what the real situation of girls is, and very much important in providing political leaders with direction and reform, but also as well holding political leaders to account for their commitments as well. Thirdly, evidence-informed campaigns, media and advocacy. This was something that was mentioned a lot, in particular, kind of the important role that civil society organisations play in supporting the role of high-level political leaders. And this kind of campaigns and advocacy that can stimulate political action and also highlight political inaction. And so this example here was of the importance of data, which gave a wider lens on which girls were able to access school, which girls weren't able to access, and kind of really working closely, this kind of civil society organisation working closely alongside political leaders so that they understood what the data was showing and how action could be taken to address some of the issues that it was highlighting. The really key finding from this was that political leaders, and high-level political leaders in particular, cannot be successful acting alone. And transformative leadership in particular requires that national political leaders give space to those who particularly understand the particular requirements and capacities of those that they're seeking to support with the policies they're developing. And this leadership means there needs to be space to amplify the voices of these diverse stakeholders that I mentioned before. And you can see here the real importance of the kind of local champions, grassroots organisations who can play a real role in ensuring that national leaders develop appropriate policies that align with the needs of the community in supporting effective implementation and hold leaders to account as well. The importance of a whole system approach also came through very strongly from the research, particularly thinking about those kind of sort of gendered norms and barriers to girls' education that are beyond the education sector. And so some of the examples that were given were about cross-sectoral measures to tackle child marriage, the importance of different ministries working together. So the Ministry of Education here in Ethiopia working with the Ministry of Women, Children and Youth Affairs, bringing together representatives from civil society, women and youth organisations, among others, in order to kind of work together for the prevention of some of the kind of key barriers to girls' education. The mobilisation and targeting of domestic resources was really highlighted as one of the key roles that political leaders can play in supporting girls' education. So one of the kind of focuses was on gender responsive budgeting, and some governments have really structured spending and taxation to advance the causes of gender equality through this process. And it involves analysing the differing impacts of budget activities and has been a really, really important mechanism through which to provide additional support to girls in education. And finally, this the mobilisation and targeting of international resources. Given that a number of the political leaders we spoke to were members of countries that donor countries, this funding or the role that international donors can play in promoting gender equality through their own budgetary commitments was also highlighted as something that has been really important. And you can see this graph there based on some calculations we did about the specific role of gender-focused spending on education from donors. So just to finish up, I want to kind of highlight the key recommendations that came out of this report that I think kind of show how this role of political leadership can be focused, and how the kind of framework through which political leaders can play a role in the progress of ensuring education for all girls. So this importance of heads of government, ministers and MPs using their platform to demonstrate the commitment and develop policies through the kind of the ways in which have been highlighted by some of these leaders in interviews, to specifically support whole system reforms for to support 12 years of education. We recommended that women leaders, particularly in their representation at every level of government, is important to improve the gender balance in decision making and act as role models. The importance of global coalitions of parliamentarians and of networks and initiatives, in particular, kind of should be established, and kind of the ones that exist continue to advocate for girls' education. And it's so great to see so many of those organisations doing fantastic work already that we'll hear from later today. The importance of data on education and evidence-informed policy, And then this kind of whole system approach, collaboration with key stakeholders, and particularly kind of this leadership that opens up platforms to key stakeholders and organizations is really, really essential. And some kind of concluding reflections just to finish on. This transformative political leadership is incredibly important and necessary for supporting girls' education, but not sufficient alone. And in particular, the report really highlights that individual leadership alone is not enough. Political leadership and the role of political leadership really needs to focus on collective action through within and cross-country coalitions so that we can transform both the formal and informal rules, both the written legislation and policies that need to be developed and promoted, but also kind of tackling the unwritten gender norms that hold girls back. Thank you very much for listening, and really looking forward to hear from all the speakers at the rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Perfect. So thank you everybody so much for tuning into Dr. Rebecca Gordon. She had some excellent takeaways from her research on the importance of government officials in prioritizing 12 years of education, and of course the importance of international networks and initiatives, which is actually a perfect segue to our next speaker, who will be talking a little bit about the importance of women government officials, herself being one, who act as incredible role models and advocates for girls' education. And so it is my real pleasure to introduce Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, Egypt's Minister of International Cooperation. Just so you know, we will be joining a new session. And so this session will be ending right now. So please do join the next session to hear Dr. Rania Al-Mashat speak. And then following that, Fatima Al-Kabi, a youth tech inventor from the United Arab Emirates, and my very own mother, who is the CEO of Affectiva, talk about the role of tech and innovation in empowering girls. So please do head over to the next session now. Stay tuned. Thanks, everybody.